Hi, and welcome to another dose of virtual vitamin Z. My name is Stephen, and I'm the curator of humane education for the Detroit Zoological Society. And today I'd like to share a humane tip of the week with you. And because the weather is getting a bit colder, this week's humane tip of the week is going to be about how to winterize your home. Now, to get started, I want to encourage you to think about some different ways that you might prepare for winter, and also think about some different ways that animals might prepare for winter. And then think about, what are some things that we might learn from animals? Because that's one of the themes that I want to focus on today. So, how to winterize your home? Well, to get started, let's think about what skills we're going to be building. So one of the things that we're going to be doing as we think about winterizing our home is attitudes we're going to be learning, knowledge we're going to be learning, skills we're going to be learning. So one of those attitudes is responsibility, this recognition that the actions that we take have an impact on other beings, other animals, and the environment, for example. And knowing that, having a sense of responsibility means being aware of that when we take action and doing our best to do the most good and the least harm. We're also going to be increasing our knowledge, in particular, our knowledge about sustainability. Now, sustainability is one of the DZS's mission pillars, and I'll talk more about it later. But really simply, it refers to minimizing the resources that we need to use so that we can leave them for other beings to use now and in the future. And then finally, the skills. As I mentioned, we're going to be learning about winterizing our home. And these are pretty simple skills, but they're skills that you'll be able to use in a lot of different contexts, and also skills you'll be able to teach other people how to use. So it'll be a great opportunity for you to not just live more humanely, but also be humane educators. Some vocabulary that we're going to be talking about as we get into this lesson includes winterize, efficiency, and sustainability. And I'll be sure to define those and call them out as I'm going through the tip. Now let's get started with winterization. So I asked you to think about what you do to prepare for winter and what animals do. And that's what I mean by winterization. And in the context of our homes, one thing we can think about is how do we prepare our home to keep us warm and comfortable during the winter? Efficiency is also something we'll be talking about. And efficiency refers to achieving a desired outcome while using as few resources as possible. So the question then becomes, if our desired outcome is preparing our home to keep us warm, how do we do that while using as few resources as possible? Because of course, one way we could do it is we could just have the heater on as high as possible all winter long, but that would probably use quite a few more resources than we would need to. And it would take those resources away from other beings who might need them more than we do. So when we think about efficiency, one metaphor that might be helpful is thinking about how we would get from point A to point B. Now, if our only goal is to get from point A to point B and we don't care about the path we take, then it would be pretty inefficient to take this path on the left. It winds around, it goes back and forth, up and down, and ultimately, walking on this path, we would get to point B, but we would get there and it would take us much longer than if we just went in a straight line. So one thing to think about is thinking about, well, how do we carry over this metaphor into winterizing our homes? And there are a few ways that we can do that. One thing to think about is checking our heating sources. Another thing is making sure that we only heat the spaces that we use. And the third thing is to heat ourselves first. Now, if we think of these three basic principles, it'll lead us to several specific actions we can take that are actually pretty easy, but it'll also help us to start noticing other things we can be doing as well. So here's another diagram that may be useful to think about. I had mentioned that one of the things to do is think about our heating source. And on the left here, I decided to use the color red to show that sometimes heat sources like a furnace work a lot harder than they have to accomplish the same outcome. And there are simple things we can do and adjustments we can make to make them work more efficiently. Another thing to think about is, Are we heating spaces that we use and spaces that we don't use, which would be inefficient? Or are we just heating spaces that we use and not heating spaces like a basement, an attic, a closet that we don't really need to be warm? And then finally, thinking about how can we heat ourselves too? One thing we can do, for example, is we can wear warm clothing even when we're indoors, and that's a way to hold more heat in. So how do we apply all of these principles and what do they end up looking like in practice? Well, one thing is checking our heating sources by checking our furnace filters. So here's a picture of my furnace in my basement. And what I want you to pay attention to is this cardboard rectangle here, just where the vent kind of bends to the left. And that's my filter. Now, the filter is important. It helps make sure that your air is clean, but over time, it can pick up a lot of different things on it that block it. And the heater has to work harder and harder and harder to get the same hot air to where it needs to go. So rather than making our heater work harder, one thing we can do is regularly check our heat sources and check our furnace filters. So for example, I checked mine. It turns out my neighbor's actually done a great job of keeping our filters replaced. As you can see, it looks pretty clean. It's supposed to be blue, but it looks pretty clean. So I decided just to put that filter back in. But if it were dirty, I could either clean it if it were a reusable filter or replace it with a fresh one. And that would be ways to make sure that our heat source is working efficiently. Now let's think about heating the spaces we use. Well, one space that we certainly don't need to heat is the outdoors. And this is a picture of a setup in my house where there's a door leading outdoors, and then right next to it, another door. And as you can see, the door leading outdoors has this maybe half-inch gap. And if I were to just leave that as it is, that would be a great place for heat to escape. And I would be doing a great job of heating the little bit of space outdoors before the cold air took over. But I don't want to do that, right? So one thing we can do is we can recognize leaks like that and seal them with what are called door snakes. This black cylinder here is a door snake. And these are things that you can certainly buy, but you can also make them. And if you aren't able to make one and aren't able to go out to the store and get one right away, you can also use things like blankets temporarily to block off any gaps that you notice to make sure that your heat is staying where you want it and not escaping to where you don't want it. Another thing to do is simply closing your window curtains. A lot of heat will escape through windows. And one thing we can do is we can see if there are any cracks in the windows or buy more insulating windows. But even simpler than that, we can just close our curtains when we don't need to be using the window, especially, for example, at night, or especially if we have a window that's not opening to the sun. That'll help insulate a little bit more, make sure again that we're not losing heat to the outdoors. And then finally, this is something that not everyone knows you can do, but we can reverse our ceiling fans. In the summer, we might want a ceiling fan to draw hot air up, keep it away from us. But in the winter, we might actually want it, because hot air rises, to bring hot air from the ceiling down. And if you look at the center of my ceiling fan here, you can see that there is a little switch. And if you move it up, it'll bring air up. If you move it down, it'll bring air down. And so that's a great way of, rather than heating the ceiling area, which we don't really need to be all that warm, we can start circulating that warm air better. And then finally, this one might seem really simple, but remember to heat yourself first. One way you can do that is by finding a sweater that's really nice and comfortable, wearing that, find a nice thick pair of socks, wear those too. And if you're feeling a little chilly, your first step can be to put on that sweater, put on those socks, and only after you find that it's really cold and they might not work as well, then maybe you can adjust your thermostat. So these are just a few tips based upon those principles that I mentioned earlier. But if you're looking for more steps or more actions, here are some other resources you can check out. Some of them are short lists, some of them are a bit longer. So feel free to check these out, see what works for you. But again, keeping in mind that metaphor of efficiency and how do I heat most efficiently? And that'll lead you in the direction of living more sustainably. Now, I mentioned earlier to not just think about things that you already do to winterize your home, but also things that animals might do. And this is one of the connections between what we're talking about today and the Detroit Zoological Society. So if you visit the Detroit Zoo, you might spend some time by the Arctic Ring of Life habitat and see the polar bears who live there. Now, polar bears are experts at staying warm in the winter. And one way they do that is by they keeping themselves warm with thick fur coats, with layers of fat, but they're also really good at living in heat efficient abodes. So a polar bear's den will do a number of things to keep them warm. One thing is that you might not think of snow as a great insulator, but snow actually does a great job of keeping warm air in. And so they dig into the snow. They also make sure that they're only digging enough space so that they can get in and lie down. And that way they don't have to heat more space that they're not using. But we don't have to go all the way to the north or the Arctic or even to the Detroit Zoo to see animals who are experts at preparing for winter. Squirrels do the same thing. And this is a photograph of one of several squirrel nests in a tree right outside my window. And as you can see, as squirrels prepare for winter, they too make sure that they're creating shelters that are small and big enough to fit them, but small enough that they don't need to heat up extra space. And they do a great job of insulating them with sticks and leaves and things like that. So next time you see a squirrel, you might look at the squirrel and say, you know what? I can learn from you how to live more sustainably myself. Thank you for that. And that leads me to another connection with the DZS, and that connection is our green print. Now, I mentioned that the DZS has among its mission pillars sustainability, and one way that we practice sustainability on site is through our green print, which is a guide to how we can move in the direction of minimizing our resource uses to save them for beings who need them more than we do now and in the future. And if you visit the Detroit Zoo or the Belle Isle Nature Center, you'll see different ways in which we do that. You'll also see those ways called out on our virtual presences online on our website, for example, and in our vitamin Z episodes. And then finally, of course, the DZS is home to the Berman Academy for Humane Education, which has the mission of helping people help animals. And I hope that by participating in this lesson, you're able to see, first of all, how you can help yourself by winterizing your home, but also able to see how when we talk about winterizing and living sustainably, we're not just talking about doing what's best for us, but also doing things that can help other animals and the environment we share with them. So I hope that you found this tip useful. If you're interested in more virtual vitamin Z, be sure to check out our website at detroitzoo.org and click on the education tab and then the link for virtual vitamin Z lessons. Until next time, stay safe and have a great day. Bye.